All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. My name is Christopher Harrison. I'm actually now a senior cloud advocate inside of Next Gen Experiences. And this is the show that I like to call Web Wednesday, where I bring on people that are much smarter than me to talk about cool things web dev. This is live, so by all means, please feel free to ask questions. Otherwise just say hi. So today I'm really pleased to be joined by Jeremy Likness. I actually had the opportunity to work with Jeremy a couple of times, many years ago on. Microsoft Virtual Academy for anybody who might remember that back in the day. And it's been so many years now. I can't even remember what it was we did. It might have been SharePoint. I don't remember now. Web API is what the voice in my head says, which is Jeremy and in the wings there. I'm bringing Jeremy on today to talk about Blazor. So we've done a couple little things about Blazor in the past, but for anybody who's not familiar, and I'll let Jeremy obviously dig much more into it, but Blazor allows you to write applications that can run in your browser with C# without downloading and installing anything. It's not like click once deployment. It's writing your application, it's writing it in C#, and then having it run inside of the browser, which I think is pretty cool. So let's go ahead and bring Jeremy on. Jeremy, thanks for joining today. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you again. It was a fun time. I think we spent something like 4 or 6 hours in the studio doing that marathon recording session for Web API, and that was 6 or 7 years ago. So
Yeah.
I'm happy to do a shorter segment.
Yeah, definitely a shorter segment and definitely much cooler. I remember those studios just always being blazing hot.
Right.
So blazing hot Blazor. See, I
Yeah, I got
yeah
it.
yeah.
That's great.
So real quick for anybody who doesn't know you, who is Jeremy? How did you become Jeremy?
Wow, that's an interesting question, and that would take a mini series, I think. But the 5,000 foot view is I'm a developer at heart. I wrote my first program at 7 years old on a 8-bit machine with 32K of memory. It was a TI 99 4A for those interested, and then I learned assembly code on a Commodore 64. But I've been a developer for most of my career. Right now, my title is program manager for .NET Data, which means I handle that experience of connecting to data for .NET developers. So even though it's not a developer in the title, I still am very much in the code. I was in product companies for quite some time. I did about 10 years of consulting as a developer, and then I joined Microsoft about 4 years ago as a cloud advocate, same group that you're in now, and was in that role for a few years before I transitioned over to this role so that I could have more of an impact on .NET.
I love it. That's fantastic. I also love the Commodore 64 background. I never did assembly, like I never got that low level, but I did write a fair amount of basic on my Commodore 64, and even on my VIC 20. I always love to tell this little story. Because that was of course back in the day when you could buy a magazine and there'd be programs and games in the magazine. You would just type them all in, and there was a Donkey
Right.
Kong clone for my VIC 20, and the shortcut for print was question mark, and you had to use the question mark because it didn't have enough memory to load the app if you actually had typed out print. So back in the old days.
Yeah, saving programs to tape cassette recorders, right?
Yes,
Playing them back.
exactly. Yeah, Lodestar 8 comma 1, absolutely 100%.
Fun times.
Indeed. So let's start, I think, with kind of the obvious question is what is Blazor? And I guess the immediate follow-up is, why would I use Blazor? And to maybe even get like a little bit more specific, why would I use Blazor as opposed to using one of the 15 million or so different JavaScript front-end frameworks that are out there? I'm sorry, I shouldn't exaggerate like that. One of the 16 million
Yeah,
JavaScript
exactly.
frameworks that are out there.
I like how you answered the question when you asked it, but no. So Blazor is something that I'm super passionate about. So I'm going to go back in time again, and some people may be familiar with this, some people may not. But there was a technology called Silverlight, and that was something that I wrote many an application in back in the day. But for those not familiar with it, Silverlight used a plugin to allow you to run C# code, basically a trimmed down version of .NET in the browser. And the appeal at the time was, as things shifted towards the web, there were a lot of developers who were used to the desktop style paradigm of programming. I have everything here, it's local, it's stateful. And Silverlight sort of translated that to the browser experience, but it was problematic in that there was this sense that it could run anywhere. But once smartphones evolved around the same time and did not allow that plugin, that idea of running everywhere sort of went away. So let's fast forward. Let's put that behind us. What Blazor does is it takes advantage of this new technology called WebAssembly. And the beautiful thing about WebAssembly is it's built into every modern browser, including the ones on your phone, on your tablet, on your desktop. WebAssembly itself can be thought of as a virtual machine. It's basically a definition for a way that a set of code runs. Now, having said that, it still is in your browser, so it still follows all of the safety mechanisms that your browser imposes. So I can't start reading files on your local disk drive and deleting those. I can only operate within the browser, but it gives me flexibility to go beyond just the script of JavaScript and actually write compiled code. In the early days of WebAssembly, there were a lot of projects that took C++ libraries or C libraries or Go or other languages and compiled them to WebAssembly. So what happened was this version of .NET was built to sit on top of WebAssembly. And .NET running in the browser sounds really cool, but by itself, it can't really do much, right? Because it's inside a sandbox. There's no UI. I can't do a console write line and have something appear on the page. So Blazor addressed that by building a framework over this version of .NET in the browser that allows interactivity with the web. And
Okay.
so it does that in a couple ways, and there's several layers to it, but I'm trying to keep this as concise as I can. But they chose to use the Razor templating engine, which is MVC developers who use MVC Razor will be familiar with. But it's a way of mixing C# and HTML in a template to render. And we'll see what that looks like. I have a demo for that. But the idea was, give me the hooks I need to be able to interact with HTML and allow me to use my C# code. So then we step back and say, why would I want to do this? And there's several reasons. A very popular reason is simply because my development team has very strong C#, F#, .NET language experience, and they want to leverage that and not learn all of the nuances of JavaScript. Not saying good or bad, right? But there's nuance there, right?
No, I like the way that you put that. I love that choice of word. There's nuance there.
Well, I'm being careful because I love JavaScript and I'll write JavaScript code all day long too. But when I'm in the C# world, it's nice to kind of stay in the C# world and not context switch and think. Like, I'll do this all the time. I'll start to write a JavaScript application and I'll use C# conventions because it's just switching between those. So that's one of the reasons, is if a team is already on C#, then it helps them leverage existing skills. it creates consistency because it's a true .NET runtime. So we're
Mm.
not talking about something that's paired. I mean, there's limitations because of the browser sandbox, but I can take a library that I built for the desktop and without recompiling it, drop it into the Blazor browser environment and it will run. So I get a continuity between what's on my server and what's on my client. I can use the exact same model attributed if I'm using data annotations, if I have business logic, instead of synchronizing and shared code and all of these extravagant and creative ways we used to synchronize code across projects, I can literally share that same library. And then another reason to do it is to tap into existing libraries. So I wrote this really cool tool that does this really cool thing, and I want to use it in my browser app. Well, with Blazor, you can just reference that C# library. I used to do a demo. I'm not going to do that today, but I used to do a demo where I built a blog markdown editor.
Mm.
And it was literally put the input field, allow you to type markdown, go out to NuGet. Oh, look, here's a markdown package that turns markdown to HTML. Install it. The author of that package never intended at the time they wrote it that it would be running in the browser. They just wrote it as a C# library. But I can pull that in without modification, and suddenly I'm transforming markdown in the browser. It's like magic.
We just need the animation
Right.
over you. Now, because of the fact that the code is running in the browser, and there's a question on this that I'm going to sort of lead into, and you sort of hinted at it as well. Is it does have that sandbox. So there are limitations on what it is that it's able to do at a relatively high level. What are some of the things that you're not able to do inside of inside of Blazor because of that browser syntax or because of that browser sandbox?
Sure. So there's things that you can't do and there's things you shouldn't do. And we'll start with the things you can't do. And you can't, for example, iterate a local file system. You have access to local storage in the browser, just like a JavaScript app would have, but you don't have access to the user's local file system. That's one example. Another example is you can only talk to the protocols that are supported by the browser. So I can talk HTTP or HTTP/2 all day long, but if I try to open a socket connection directly to a SQL server, which is not a port that the browser sandbox allows, that's not going to work. So I'm back to this paradigm of I'm not going to write code that talks directly to SQL Server. I'm going to talk to an API endpoint that on the server then talks to SQL Server, for example. So that's those are a couple limitations. There's some system drawing libraries, right, that don't translate to the Canvas paradigm in the browser. So I can't do some of the rendering and some of the input and output that I would have as peripherals on a machine that are not accessible from the browser. And then the other thing that's really important is I should never, ever, 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 ever store credentials like super secret connection strings to a database or to a service or an endpoint because I'm in the client and I have to assume that they will be able to see whatever I store locally in the browser.
Right, which I mean is good programming practice anyway. But yeah,
Right.
definitely, I could see that becoming more important. Sevian does ask a specific question about, I'll just read it as it is. So .NET 5 doesn't have the crypto APIs needed to run the AWS SDK, specifically Cognito. Do you have any advice, or is there something maybe coming with .NET 6 that might fix that? Are you familiar with that library? Let's, I guess, kind of start there.
Not familiar with that library, and my colleague Barry Dorans is probably the one to ask about all things crypto. But I do know there are some crypto libraries, like there's protected storage, which is there's implementations of that. However, like the data protection APIs that come with Microsoft because of the way they're tied to machine keys. And again, I'm not the expert in the area, but I do know there's limitations that prevent them from doing that. And I also know that there's certain types of crypto that at a very high level understanding of it, the fundamentally you don't get what you need to make it secure crypto in the browser for however that algorithm works. And again, I'm speaking out of ignorance here, just based on being a fly on the wall hearing conversations. But so I do not know if those plans are in .NET 6. That's definitely something we can look into. You can find Dan Roth on Twitter. We can post that. He's a PM over the Blazor product and is on top of a lot of the roadmap there. But that's a great question that I unfortunately don't know the answer to.
Okay. All right. And I appreciate that. I don't know is always an acceptable answer. Like I will always take that over, somebody just like making it up and then it turns out that that they're wrong. So I always appreciate that. There's another real quick question from Rick who says, there's an inconsistency with some functionality between quote unquote normal .NET 5 and Blazor WASM. For instance, getting the localized name of culture info. Is that something that the Blazor WASM is going to be able to come up to par with?
Another great question. Don't know the details to that, but I do know that there are constraints in the way that a machine registers certain properties that the runtime can pick up versus what's available in the browser. And I'm going to go ahead and preempt and say that another difference, since we're talking about those, is the threading model in JavaScript is very different than the threading model, or even WebAssembly, I should say, than the threading model on a typical machine. So there are some caveats for how asynchronous code is managed and run. Basically, the way Blazor is designed, and I'm assuming this goes down to the underlying .NET framework, is no blocking calls because it would freeze the browser basically.
Right. Okay. And in fact, Fuel sort of follows up that question is, are there threads even in the browser? And I guess sort of my follow-up is, and I'll spend just a second on this, for anybody who's not familiar, typically the way that you're able to simulate anything that's going to be multi-threaded is either by using WebWorker or potentially by doing some form of async calls, which is going to give you that asynchronous, so that way you're not making blocking calls. So is there something that equates to like a WebWorker inside of Blazor?
Not that I am aware of, but again, since I've done a deep dive in it, I know that there were proposals looking at, and part of it is not Blazor specific, it's WebAssembly.
Okay.
So WebAssembly had proposals for multi-threading, and I know once those came into play, then the .NET layer could support those, and then once that happens, then Blazor could. Whether or not that happened with .NET 5, I don't think it has yet.
Okay. Okay. That's cool. I appreciate your honesty and also your willingness to take all of these questions. I know we sort of came at you with a whole bunch of advanced questions here, so I appreciate.
Oh no, those
all
are
of your
great.
insights.
And if people ask me about state management and storage and some of the APIs, I'm ready to go. But yeah, there's the cryptography and threads are on the edge of the.
Yeah, no, that's totally cool. And honestly, I can remember now the last time I wrote like web worker code. And even then it was only just because I was teaching a course and part of it had like a web worker thing on it. So I know the basics of how to do it, but if this was an interview question on, write web worker code, I wouldn't get the job.
Well, there is an interesting, in the demo that I'm going to show in a little bit, there's an interesting feature that looks like threading and just shows how the framework has done a lot of work to give more conventional experiences, I'll say, even though it's mapping to mechanisms that are part of the browser, they feel like .NET mechanisms, and that'll make sense when I show it because I have a timer that I use in one of the examples.
Okay. All right. So then it sounds like, even if you're not necessarily doing like creating web worker, that you can still do some of those types of things and sort of do it in a natural C# way of doing
Absolutely.
things.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, I mean, since you sort of mentioned it, what how do I want to form this question? How do I start creating a Blazor application? Like, is it just file new project inside of Visual Studio? If I'm using VS Code, how do I do it there?
Great question. So it's installed as part of the web workload. So basically, if you're doing command line and you're using Visual Studio Code, you'll have the template available. If you install Visual Studio and you use the web workload, it's packaged as part of ASP.NET Core. So
Okay.
it comes out of the box with .NET 5 pretty much. But let me, since you asked the question, and I hadn't prepared a VS Code demo, but let's take a look at what it looks like from the command line, and then I can jump into Visual Studio and show you what it looks like from within Visual Studio.
100%. Yeah, let's see it.
Okay, so here is my command line, and if we do a .NET new, and here, let me zoom in to the corner for you.
And you're using WSL here. Like this is running on Linux.
This is actually Git Bash.
Oh,
So
okay.
this
Oh,
will
okay.
work very similar from command. This is like a layer on top of a regular command line that lets me use bash-like commands.
Okay.
So this is, I'm not in Linux, I'm on Windows, I'm doing .NET New, but with Blazor being cross-platform, we have access to these, across the board. But we've got a bunch of different options here, and here we have Blazor Server and Blazor WASM. So it probably makes sense to take a moment and talk about Blazor Server and Blazor WASM. So I'll do a quick side note, and then I'll show you the app. Blazor WebAssembly is what I focus on and what I've spent most of my time, and that was the initial implementation of Blazor. What the team found is that the way Blazor was implemented, they could completely decouple the engine from the rendering logic. And what that means is it was initially designed as something that lives inside the web and can render inside the web, but they realized for various reasons there could be an option to use the same syntax, the same engine, the same programming style, but create a server version that instead of using WebAssembly, uses the server to render all the code and handle the logic, and basically places a really light JavaScript shim in the browser that acts like a proxy relay. If you've been programming for a while, think of it as an update panel, a really big update panel, but without all the baggage that came with those back in the day. But the idea is I have a little bit of code, and then it talks to the server. When you click on a button, instead of the code running, hey, let's respond to a button inside the browser, sends that to the server. The server says, here's how I'll respond, and sends it back. Now, having said that, you get similar functionality. I can use the same templates. I can have even the same UI shared between WebAssembly and server. Some reasons why you'd want to use server is if, for example, you wanted code that connects to legacy services that are part of .NET Framework and not part of .NET Core. So that would be one example. Maybe you want to have that direct database connection that you can't have from the browser. And, so there's that. And it uses Signal R behind the scenes. That's how it does the real-time push. So if you want the load, and the caveat is the load all goes on the server because the server's now doing the rendering and the processing, and there's no offline mode. It has to be connected to run. So if those aren't acceptable, then you go to the client side. So it can be a little confusing that there's two versions, but basically if you need .NET Framework access directly from your Blazor code, and you're not going through a web API for that, then you may need to use the server version. So I've got, was
Yeah.
there a question
Nope.
before I show? Okay, so
Yeah, go for it.
we're going to do .NET New, Blazor WASM. I'm going to do output Actually, let me get to a safe place. Let's do that first. .NET new Blazor WASM
I think that's just
output.
universally true. Like, always get to a safe place first.
Absolutely. So this is going to scaffold a project. And we can go into this is it. And you can see we've got a very simple project there, and we can use Visual Studio Code. I've got the insiders version, so I'm on the edge and getting new features as they come out. But if we look at this one, this is the Razor syntax I was talking about. Oh, these are the imports. Let's look at an actual page. So you can see there's a mix of HTML. We've got H1 counter, we've got P. Then we've got, for a paragraph tag, then we've got this code block that is just C# code. And I very easily create this variable, and just by putting the @ sign in front of it in the HTML code, I create a binding to it.
So that would sort of be like doing, double curlies or things like that in a lot of other JavaScript frameworks.
Exactly.
Okay.
So basically, like an Angular data bind command. I haven't been on the React wagon, so I don't know the syntax for that. But I did do a lot of Angular, and this is sort of similar to that. But I've also got this @onClick event that basically is pointing to a method.
Mm-hmm.
So this is binding the browser side click to the C# code that's running this increment count. And let's go ahead and do these build assets. And then I hit F5 and run it. I'm not going to do it now because I have a bigger demo to show, but basically I've created something out of the box. The other interesting things that I want to show about this is in your program startup, you've got this WebAssembly host builder. So this is very similar to the host builder pattern if you've done ASP.NET Core applications. It's just a different convention for wiring things up. I still have dependency injection. Here it's actually adding an HTTP client, and it's using the environment to set the base address, which basically, if this is now served from an ASP.NET Core app, so you've got the client running in the browser, but if you have a set of services, APIs, this will automatically set up that HTTP client to talk to that endpoint. So I'm not having to do like hard coding the endpoint. I can have it mapped to different environments, etc.
You don't have to worry about cores or any of that nonsense.
Exactly. And this is showing, I've got this inject here at the top. So that's how I'm using dependency injection in the page. So I'm saying, give me that HTTP client I configured. We're going to call it HTTP because we're very creative with naming. And then down here, this should be fairly familiar. With a client, you would use a get or a put or a fetch, and this has a helper extension method, get from JSON async.
And
it's
that's just
using
basic normal .NET code. Like that's the normal HTTP client that's available in .NET Core.
Right. So I'm going to close this one out.
I do have one real quick question, just especially because you kind of mentioned JavaScript real quick. This isn't being like big, and I'll use like TypeScript as an example. That if I'm using TypeScript, that gets transpiled into JavaScript before it's run. That's not what you're doing here. That what you're doing here is you're running that C# inside of that inside of that WASM sandbox.
That's right. In fact, I'll even show that in the browser.
Okay.
In this next example.
Yeah. Let's see it.
Let's take a look here. And all I did, by the way, to get this project, and I'll go through what the project looks like in a second, but I did File, New, Project, and I picked Blazor. Then you get a checkbox if you want server or client. You get some options. So when you're doing the client, you get, well, actually, let's just open a new instance and walk through it instead of me kind of trying to describe it. Let's do
Picture a
And
browser
this,
in your head.
yeah, picture a browser in your head. Imagine a dialog box. Okay, so we're going to do a new project. And the hardest thing apparently for Visual Studio to do right now is figure out what project templates I have. Okay, and here you can see I've used Blazor WebAssembly quite a bit. Let's just search for templates. We'll do Blazor right here. And so you can see you've got Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly, and this explains the differences in the text there. It's very convenient for that. If we do Blazor WebAssembly, we get to name it, give it a location and a solution name. So I'm just going to keep these defaults because I'm just really showing the dialog here.
Web
Now I get
application
to,
one. I have to admit I haven't used Visual Studio in quite a while. So just like seeing web application one, it warms my heart.
it's a beautiful thing. I used to be at like web application 254, but then I cleared out my temporary projects folder. So
See, now I'm curious what would have happened if you would have gotten, beyond 256, if like, the universe will just collapse into itself.
well, we already passed 0xFF, so we were at 0x100, so I think we were fine.
Okay.
We've got an authentication type. So Blazor will support building, for example, Active Directory authentication. And basically the way it does it is it interacts with a web API and gets a token, and then it has provisions for refreshing that token. You can configure for HTTPS, and then you've got these two checkboxes here. ASP.NET Core hosted simply means this. Blazor is a true single page application. So if you've worked with React or Angular or whatever, you know that application is really standalone. It can be served, however, once it's in the browser, it's alive and well. Now, typically it needs something on the server to communicate with, but the application itself is standalone. Blazor is the same way. Blazor WebAssembly can be packaged itself. If you choose the ASP.NET Core hosted option, it will be served to the browser from an ASP.NET Core app, which then allows you to use the server side to stand up web APIs so that you have your projects together. This is what's running in the client, and this is on the server. You can have them separate. Checking this box allows you to put them together in the same solution, basically, the two projects.
But it is worth highlighting that if you wanted to run your server API, say using Django or Flask or Node or PHP or whatever it is that the cool kids are using these days, you are able to do that.
Yes.
Okay.
You could talk to a Node backend from Blazor. You could even serve Blazor from Nginx, right? Or Nginx or however it's pronounced.
Sure.
So there's a lot of options there. And then this one, I think, should be exciting to several people, and that's progressive web application. So by checking that, Blazor will scaffold everything needed to create what's called a service worker, a manifest, etc. Short story boring, you end up with an application that can run offline, which is very powerful. You can have an installable app. If I'm not connected to the internet, I'm on the plane, and it's like, for example, a blog post editing tool. I can still edit my blog and save it, locally, and then synchronize it when I go online. So that is supported by this.
I use Outlook as a progressive web app. So I actually just went to OA, hit that little plus in my browser URL bar. I've got OA installed as a PWA, and that's actually now how I do it. I do not use Outlook, yeah, my life has been better ever since.
It's amazing how powerful PWAs are because
Yeah.
they literally work everywhere, right? So.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to abort out of that, and let me show you the demo app, and then we can work backwards into what goes into it. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer those before I hit play.
Yeah.
We're good?
Yep. Actually, hold on. Let's, all right.
That's okay.
Okay.
The hamster's running to get
Okay.
the spinner going. So
While the hamster is doing its thing, so Rick did say he's got one more advanced question, so I'm gonna go ahead and throw it out there. That there was a talk a while back about Blazor Native, where Blazor would be able to render components based on the OS it runs on. So Blazor could then be used to render a native Android control on Android, iOS control on an iPhone, etc. Is that still a thing? Is there progress on that, or?
I've heard Blazor Native. I'm not as involved with that
Okay.
project, and the reason I don't give an answer right away is because I know, for example, there's a few things going on, right? We've got the Blazor mobile bindings for the mobile experience. We've got .NET MAUI, which is that unification across platforms. And so I have not been as up to date on those. So I'm not sure where Blazor Native fits in. I know it was a thing, I've heard of it, but I don't know the recent status of
Okay.
that.
Totally cool.
Okay, so what we've got here, I've taken the out of the box application. So the template comes with this home, this counter, this fetch data. The fetch data is kind of cool because it will go out and grab some random information from the server. But what's cool about it is if you look in the project, the class that it uses for the weather data is the exact same class on the client and the server. So it shares a class library and uses that exact class. So it's a great example of that. If we go to the home page, what I did is I wanted an example that had more than a couple records. And being kind of a programmer at heart, I decided, oh yeah, there's a lot of types that ship out of the box in .NET. So let's write a little database loader that pulls out types and then iterates methods on those types. And we have a database that's basically a relationship of types to methods, just for an example, because I wanted to have some data. So what I can do is I can explore these types, and I'll show that in a second. Let me show you what happens when we load this. So if I F12 to view my console tools, and I go to network, and then I'm just going to go ahead and refresh this page. And what you see immediately is we've got a little bit of a JavaScript shim. I did not have to write that. That comes out of the box with Blazor. That bootstraps the WebAssembly. It pulls this Blazor boot. Then look at this. Whoever thought that you would actually see the .NET framework as a JavaScript file in the browser. And so that's some of the shims for that. What you're not seeing, and let me disable cache and force a refresh. And if this doesn't work, I'll go to an in private window because I want to show you kind of the load behind the background. Yeah, it's not showing that. So there's some optimizations. I'm pretty sure some of the things are being stored to local storage to benefit this, but let's copy this. And let's do no, I don't want to try collections. Let's do a new and private window. And again, I'm going to open up my network. I'm going to paste this in. And there, now you're starting to see these files are literally DLLs being loaded into the browser.
Okay. All right.
So when you ask, is this a thing? It's translated to JavaScript, et cetera. No, this is pulling actual DLLs and running them in a .NET version in the browser. There's a lot of DLLs in debug, but when you compile this and publish it in release mode, it does do optimizations and tree shaking. And for those not familiar with tree shaking, what that means is it'll actually scan libraries for code. And if that code's not called anywhere in your application, it'll delete the code to streamline the size of the delivery. And I think this application that I'm showing you, when it is in release mode, has a 8 megabyte footprint,
Okay.
which to put it in perspective, a lot of your media pages, like if you go and watch videos on YouTube, it's about 8 megs to load the main page of that. Let's close that out. So I wanted
And
to
I was just going to
okay.
say, but it is worth so there's two things that are worth highlighting. Number one is I think that importance of production mode, which is I think one of the things that's most commonly forgotten by new .NET developers is making sure that they're doing a production release all up. But then the second thing is once that's downloaded, it looks like because the browser is going to cache that and so forth, that they're not going to get that 8 meg hit then when they're going back to that page, assuming that there hasn't been updates.
Right. Yeah. If I do a hard just reload the page from scratch based on cache and the DLL is already being downloaded, if we look down here, there were 6 kilobytes transferred to get me back on the main page,
Okay.
370 kilobytes of resources. So
There's
after
basically
that,
no web page in the world that you're going to be able to download for 6K these days.
right, exactly. So after you get that first download, you're doing pretty well. So let me show you the app and then we'll look at how the app works. I'm typing system to do a search, and this search is actually going to the server. It's a little bit slow because I'm using a SQLite database. That just makes this more cross-platform compatible and doesn't force you to have a SQL server. So here it's got 4,000 matches. These are just the names of the types it found. And then if I click on one of them and all these SR types like system action, then over here I get some of the methods, and I can expand that and look at the signature to the method. So this is all coming over the wire from a database. And this is my creative aesthetic styling. I know some people will want to hire me to design their website after they see this, but I'm not. Actually, I'm aesthetically challenged, but I did want to show some of the new features of Blazor. And to start with, just at a higher level, before we get into like APIs and databases and everything, this is using something called CSS isolation, which is really cool. If you've been on those big line of business projects that have multiple moving parts, you may have had a designer whose full-time job was to maintain that dictionary of classes and styles across the application and come up with creative names. And maybe you're using Bootstrap and you're extending it and using all these different styles. And so I have a class for a method class and a type class, etc. If we look at the code for this, I have this modularized. So in a method, it's using something called type details. Let me pull that up. So I'm not going to get into the code, but I just want to show you that this has an H2 tag. It has a code tag. It has a container. So it's using some Bootstrap. And then it's loading these method details. But my styling is just a CSS file. And here, let me show that right here. So there's a CSS file with this. My styling is just styling the div container. Now, if I did this in a master CSS file, all of my div containers would suddenly have a height of 70% of the view height and this auto overflow. But because of CSS isolation, when we look at what's actually happening behind the scenes, let me go back to network again, and I'll show you what that looks like. So we're going to refresh this. And we should get a, oh, it's been cached. I need to disable cache again. We should get a special, so we get this shiny Blazor. I called it shiny Blazor because I'm trying to show shiny new things. And then we get client.styles.css. And if we look at that, we can see stuff that we would probably never write. I could never come up with a class name this creative. Bjexkid0. But what it basically does is it simply takes all your different components, and this component defined a div, this one defined an H2, and it generates a unique class name so that it's unique to the component so that they don't overlap and collide with each other. That is CSS isolation.
I think that one kind of important thing there, though, is the fact that it did take that CSS and it's just serving that up as regular CSS. So that Blazor
Yes.
application that you're getting, it's not like creating a Silverlight app. It's not like creating a Flash app where it's running inside of effectively a plugin. And so now all of that winds up becoming this like weird black box, that it is generating HTML and CSS that's being displayed on the page.
Correct. And that is everything I work with. Here, let me open up the main page here, this index.razor. So here, I'm styling it with an H1 tag. And this is that system timers I talked about earlier. We'll take a look at that. But I'm using a paragraph tag. So all of this is styled, and I'm just using the Bootstrap that comes out of the box, which is the default with Blazor. You can swap it out for something else and have your own CSS. But that's how I'm managing it all, is just through CSS and class tags.
Okay. Say one question that came in, and I think it's sort of kind of a natural spot to ask it, especially since we just talked about bringing in CSS files, is Irvin asked over on Learn TV, can we combine Blazor with a traditional JavaScript framework app, say like in React, or maybe I'm like going to progressively add in Vue or something like that?
The answer is yes, you can do anything. Is it easy? Probably not so much.
Okay.
But it is possible. It'd be similar to having multiple Angular apps running in the same space. You can do that. When you need to interop between them, you just need to have that mechanism. So the nice thing about Blazor is even though you don't have to know JavaScript for you, the reality is you may be using JavaScript libraries, you may have existing code. So there is JavaScript interop. And what I can do is I can go both ways. I can explicitly ask to call JavaScript code from .NET, and there's an interface, IJS interop is the last time I worked with it, that you bring in, and then it has an execute async, and you give it the name and you give it parameters. It does all the conversion of the parameters from C# primitive types to what JavaScript needs. So there is that facility. Conversely, you can also expose Blazor to JavaScript. So you can tag a method as callable, and then there's a set of methods that are exposed in the JavaScript client space that allow you to call into .NET from JavaScript.
Okay. Then the next follow-up that Irvin also asks is, can Blazor then work with common third-party JavaScript controls like Telerik, Kendo, or maybe like Bootstrap? And it sounds like at the very least with Bootstrap, the answer to that would definitely be yes, because after all, Bootstrap is mostly just a CSS library. And yes, there's JavaScript components to it, but you can actually get a lot of functionality out of Bootstrap with just CSS. So it sounds like that would be a pretty easy yes. But how about like third-party JavaScript controls?
So it can, and there are some third-party vendors who basically just wrap their existing JavaScript controls in C# classes so that you can call them from Blazor. You could do that yourself and just create some interop classes that are APIs that you call. The control vendors, though, that build native controls take advantage of the optimized rendering that Blazor has. And so it's just like with an Angular app, the way change detection works. If you're dealing with a third-party component just wrapping the JavaScript, it doesn't necessarily know when it has to re-render. Whereas if you're building it as part of the Blazor project, there's a render tree that Blazor keeps track of, and it understands if there's a mutation to a property on a class over here, that it means it needs to re-render this piece that depends on that. So there's some optimization concerns that come out of that, I guess, is the best answer.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Okay.
So the other thing I want to show, I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, so I want to dive into something a little more advanced. At a high level, I've got this worked out as controls. So if we look at this main index page, I've got some typical, like I have a service that just increments a counter. So every time I make an async call, which you can see down here, let's see. So here I start my async operation, I do my async call, and then I call end async. All that's doing is it's just a service that keeps track of a counter. If the counter is greater than 0, it says something's in progress. And then I can use that and condition things so this fragment will only render if that is busy flag is set. And I don't have to do anything special. I just wrap it in an if statement and it will be deleted from the DOM if the condition is false and inserted into the DOM if the condition is true. So that's how I show my loading. I can disable my controls based on that. And then I can do some things like here I'm data binding. So I'm binding what you're typing into the input field into this type match property. And the type match property, if you notice in the app, if I loaded every time I typed, I would be stuck forever. But I can type entity framework comfortably and nothing happens. The instant I pause, then it loads the data. So I have a debounce, which is a pretty common paradigm in the web, and I implement that with a timer. So I was talking about some of the threading things. Basically, in the property setter, I always start a timer with a 400-second interval, and it has a callback when that 400 seconds passes. So every
400
time I type,
milliseconds?
400 milliseconds. So every time I type, it's resetting the timer. The instant I pause for at least 400 milliseconds, it's able to fire, and then it actually takes whatever I typed. And this is a pretty complicated call to get the counts of await, get counts, execute async. Or in the case of the types that it's getting, it's basically calling preview types, execute async, it's adding the range to the list, and that's it. Everything else sort of falls through the components, which if we look here, my components, if I have type matches, and again, I'm just using natural C# code here. So if I've got matches, I show how many matches were found, and then I have this type list control. If we go into the type list control, that lists the types, and then it has a type details control it talks to that when you click it, it expands it. But this, notice this virtualized is a flag that I'm passing. I wanted to show you this because this is a new feature in Blazor that I used to do this for each type name and type matches, and then I have a control that shows the name and takes the click. What I can do now is I can wrap it in this virtualize. And the difference is that if I don't have it virtualized, that's what you saw basically. It's going to load the data. It's going to give me this massive list. And this will help it speed up, right? See, I started to spin my mouse and it came right back. So this entire list was rendered with all of the controls inside of it that I'm dragging through. Let's do virtualize now. And let's just reload the data. So now what's happening is it's hard to see on this because I have such a simple control, but these are now rendered dynamically. And you can see I can take this and pull it down really fast instead of like forcing through the scroll, because what it's doing, and notice how it blanks a little bit when I'm scrolling, that's because it's only rendering what's in view as opposed to rendering the whole list. So that's going to save memory on the client and give the perception of better performance. I say perception because at the end of the day, it's still the same render time. It's just rendering all up front versus rendering on the fly as you're scrolling to a different area.
And I'm guessing that generally speaking, you would want to do that as virtualized on longer items, because typically whatever it is that people want, hopefully would be on the first spot. You know, sort of going with that old saying that nobody ever gets to page 3 of an internet search.
Exactly right. So let me show you one more thing. I know we're getting close to it, and I do want to answer questions. this whole round trip from the client to the server. On the client, I have this type that has a ID and a name with a collection of methods. And then I have some tags that come with the GraphQL library I'm using. I'll talk about those in a second. So that's a type. This is a method. So the method has a declaring type, so it's referencing back up to the type. It has a return type, is public, a parameter signature. So just things interesting about a method. Those are just C# classes. I'm using Entity Framework Core to map this to the database. So I have this context that basically just says store types and methods in the database. This just describes the relationship. Type has many methods, and the method navigates back to the parent using this declaring type. This is just seed code on how I create the database. This is all the lines that I need to basically define my interface to the database. What I'm doing in the startup is I'm adding that DB context right here, and I'm passing it in options. So here I'm using SQLite, but I could use that same DB context, go to SQL Server, any other number of things. I'm also logging the commands so that I can see the SQL that's generated. The way I've exposed this is through something called GraphQL. GraphQL is a whole topic in and of itself, but what's nice about GraphQL is it allows me to be very specific about what I want on the client. So here I'm exposing 4 endpoints, if you will, a count of the types, a count of the methods, a way to get the types, and a way to get the methods. That's all the work that I do on this, other than wiring in the GraphQL. And the wire up is pretty straightforward. I basically just say add GraphQL server, and then down here I'm saying map the GraphQL endpoint. What that gives me is a ton of functionality. On the client, what I did is I ran a tool and I said, look at the server, talk to that GraphQL endpoint, and generate a schema. This was done automatically, so don't feel like I had to type this in. I just pointed this at the server, and it gave me sort of a dictionary of all the things, all the operations I can perform. So just those 4 lines of code gave me all of this. For the application itself, I said, for example, to get the counts, here's my definition for the count. I want types count and methods count. For something more specific for the type, where I get the methods for the type, I say pass in a type, get the methods, and here are the fields that I want on the methods. So I'm very specific about that. This will auto-generate a client, and I already showed that code where I await the client and get that.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really nice about it is it only returns the fields I ask for. So this avoids overfetching. Instead of getting all these methods and properties, when I'm just getting that type list where you're selecting the type you want to look at, I'm telling it filter on the type, but this is the only thing I want back. And if you look down the stack, the network request just gets name. The query that's sent to the database just asks for name. That whole pipeline just wires together. And I wish we had more time to dig into more detail on that, but I wanted to show that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. What I really like is I know that like getting GraphQL set up can be a little bit of a challenge, but it looks like then, you know, Blazor and ASP.NET can even handle a lot of that for me. This was great. We're going to need to figure out a way to get you back on so we can kind of get in and show off more code. So expect an email from me. But in the meantime, where can people find you, Jeremy?
I'm on Twitter, and a very unique Twitter name at Jeremy Likness. I'm on LinkedIn as Jeremy Likness. You can find me. You can email me at Microsoft. I'm very responsive. I'm very happy to share. First name dot last name at Microsoft.com. And definitely, if you are on Twitter, I tweet about developments related to .NET, Data, Blazor, Web. And I try to do my best to curate some of the best blog posts and links that I find and share those. So definitely take a look for me there. And then I'll just add one more plug. I was diagnosed early last year with young onset Parkinson's disease and decided that I wanted to be an advocate for that and was very vocal and open about the diagnosis. And my wife and I just launched a podcast to raise awareness called You, Me, and PD. So if you go to youmeandpd.org, youmeandpd.org, you can access that podcast. We've got one episode out. We're about to record the second episode, but super excited about that.
That's fantastic, and thank you for sharing, and thank you for being open about your journey. I'm certain that will help a lot of people out there. So thank you for having the strength and the willingness to do that. I greatly appreciate that.
Well, thank you.
So yeah. And thanks for joining. Let's not go 5 years without talking to one another again. Let's try to figure out how to connect again between now and then, and we'll figure out a way to have you on. So thanks again, Jeremy, for joining. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. This has been Web Wednesday, and we're back next week for what are we talking about next week? We're talking about Babylon JS and creating 3D experiences with Cassie.
Cool.
Yeah, so definitely tune into that. So thank you to everybody for tuning in, and have a great night. Thank you. Bye.